There's something about the rain. The way it washes things away, the way it muffles sound. It's supposed to be peaceful, but in the wrong place at the wrong time, it drowns everything. Even screams. It was the summer of 2011. 4 friends, Ethan, Mark, Jared and Lisa, set up camp deep in Los Padres National Forest. They had done this before. They weren't amateur campers. They picked a remote site, far from the usual trails, surrounded by nothing but towering trees and silence. The first day was normal. They arrived at the site in the late afternoon, hauling their backpacks through the thick brush, their boots crunching against damp leaves. The air was humid but cooling as the sun dipped below the tree line. Mark, the most experienced camper, quickly took charge, setting up the tents while Ethan gathered firewood. Lisa unpacked the food, and Jared, ever the lazy one, was already lying on a log, staring up at the sky through the web of tree branches above. It was peaceful. By the time the fire was roaring, the smell of sizzling hot dogs filled the air. They sat around, joking, sharing stories, the kind of stories meant to spook each other, but ones they would laugh about moments later. The ones that didn't feel real. The stars were bright that night. A deep, endless black sky freckled with light. No city noise, no hum of passing cars, just the sound of crickets, the occasional owl hooting, and the distant rustle of trees shifting in the wind. Ethan was in good spirits, cracking jokes, poking at the fire with a stick. He was the loudest of the group, the one who always had something sarcastic to say, the kind of person who made everything feel normal, even in the middle of nowhere. Then the rain came. At first it was a light drizzle, barely noticeable. The kind that speckled their jackets but wasn't enough to make them move. Then the temperature dropped, and within minutes it transformed into a heavy, punishing downpour. The fire sputtered, their laughter died down, and suddenly the vast open forest felt smaller. The rain blurred everything beyond a few feet. The world outside the reach of their flashlight beams ceased to exist. They scrambled to gather their things, stuffing food into coolers, throwing blankets into the tents. The sound of the rain against the tarp was deafening, like 1,000 fingers drumming against the fabric. "Ethan, guess that's it for the fire." The others laughed quietly, settling in. The rain continued. It had a strange rhythm, inconsistent, almost unnatural. The way it hit the tent wasn't just a downpour, it almost sounded like footsteps. Maybe it was just the wind pushing against the trees. Maybe it was the paranoia that always settled in when surrounded by miles of nothingness. Then, just as they were beginning to drift off, Ethan spoke again. "Ethan, I gotta take a leak." "Mark, dude, just go outside the tent." "Ethan, nah, I'm not peeing right next to where I sleep." The others grumbled, half asleep, barely registering the sound of Ethan unzipping the tent and stepping out into the rain. He never came back. At first they assumed he was messing around. They shouted for him, their voices barely cutting through the storm. The sound of the rain hitting the canopy above and the soaked ground below absorbed everything. It was suffocating. They grabbed their flashlights and searched. Their beams sliced through the darkness, but there was nothing. No movement, no sounds, just rain. Then they found them. Ethan's footprints. A single set, pressed deep into the mud, leading away from the camp and into the forest. They followed, 20 feet, 50 feet, 100, then they just stopped. No return prints, no dragged footsteps, just an abrupt end in the middle of nowhere, as if Ethan had simply been lifted into the air. Panic set in. They shouted louder, their voices cracked, but Ethan was gone. They searched until dawn, their flashlights flickering, their voices raw from shouting his name. The rain didn't stop. It poured relentlessly, drenching their clothes, filling their boots with water. The world felt distant, like they weren't supposed to be there. By morning, authorities searched the area. Dogs, helicopters, a full search team. No sign of Ethan, no torn clothing, no evidence he had ever been there. But a year later, a new group of campers came to the same spot, and in the mud, they found a set of fresh footprints leading into the woods, ending at the exact same spot Ethan's had. Then the rain started, and they heard it. A whisper, a breath, a name. Ethan, Ethan. Then the footsteps started again, slow, wet, coming toward them. The storm swallowed their screams. There's something unsettling about driving in the rain. The way it distorts your vision, turns reflections into shadows. Your headlights reveal only what's right in front of you. Everything else is lost in the dark. It was 1995. A couple was driving home after a dinner date. They were taking a back road through rural Pennsylvania, miles from the nearest town. The rain had been falling for hours, heavy, relentless. The windshield wipers could barely keep up. The narrow road was slick, winding through dense patches of trees, their twisted limbs reaching over the pavement like skeletal fingers. Everything was silent, save for the rhythmic swish of the wipers and the drumming of raindrops against the roof of the car. The glow of the headlights barely cut through the fog that hovered just above the road, moving like something alive. Then, something appeared in their headlights. A body, lying in the middle of the road. The car screeched to a halt. The tires skidded slightly on the wet asphalt. A man, thin, drenched. His clothes were soaked through, sticking to his bony frame. His skin was pale, too pale. His lips slightly parted, his eyes wide open, staring straight at the sky. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The rain poured over the body, running in rivulets down his face. Her voice barely carried over the storm. The man gripped the steering wheel. He didn't want to get out. Something felt wrong. The body should have looked different. Injuries, blood, a sign of what had happened. But there was nothing. No wounds. Just water pooling beneath him. Then he moved. A single gasping inhale. Then, with slow, jerky movements, he sat up. His head turned toward the car. His lips moved, whispering. They couldn't hear the words over the rain, but they could feel them. A vibration in their bones, a static charge in the air. Then the corpse began to stand. Not smoothly, his limbs twitched as if something unseen was pulling him upright. His movements were unnatural, disjointed like a puppet on tangled strings. Drive now. He hesitated. The figure in the road was now tilting its head, watching them. The lips were still moving, whispering something soundless. Then the figure took a step forward. A wet, sloshing step. That was enough. The man slammed the accelerator, jerking the car forward. The figure remained in the rearview mirror, watching them. But as they passed, the woman turned to look, just for a second, and the figure was suddenly closer, right beside her window. Mouth still moving, still whispering, screaming. The car fishtailed slightly before speeding down the road, disappearing into the storm. They didn't speak for the rest of the drive, didn't turn on the radio, didn't dare to check the mirrors again. Somehow they knew they weren't alone. The rain continued, hammering against the windshield, almost deafening now. Every shadow on the road seemed to shift, elongate. The trees lining the road seemed taller, looming over them like silent watchers. Then the car lurched, like something had grabbed the back of it. The man struggled to control the wheel. The woman was sobbing now, her hands covering her mouth. "It's here! It's here!" He pressed the gas pedal to the floor. The car fought against something, some unseen force dragging them back. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. They didn't look back, not until they reached the highway. Only then did they dare to check the back of the car. And what they found didn't make sense. The entire back end was soaking wet, more than the rain, more than possible. And there were fingerprints streaked across the trunk, long, wet, clawing. They called the police as soon as they reached town, but when officers arrived, the road was empty, no body, no footprints, just wet pavement, slick with rain. That night, neither of them could sleep. They kept hearing it, the whisper, the gasping breath. And then, days later, another driver reported the same thing. Same road, same rain, same whispering corpse. The whispers were getting closer. And then one night, the couple heard it again. Not on the road, not on the news, but outside their window, a whisper, faint, muffled by the rain. It was saying something, a name, his name. Then came the knock, soft, wet, rhythmic. He didn't move, he didn't breathe. The knocking continued, then stopped. When he finally got the courage to check the peephole, there was nothing. But the rain had left something behind. A single wet footprint, right outside the door, and somewhere in the distance, he swore he heard a whisper, still whispering his name.